When evaluating a navy, one must first consider its doctrine. Is the navy in question a riverine force? Is it a coastal defense force? Is it supposed to defend far-off colonies? Is it supposed to be a dominant navy capable of global force projection? It would be unfair to call the massive riverine forces of the U.S. Navy during the Civil War bad because they could not sail to Europe and beat the Royal Navy. It would be equally unfair to say that the Royal Navy was a terrible fleet because it could not sail up the Mississippi and beat the Americans. Both had their roles in doctrine. Both were built for specific purposes, with a specific enemy in mind. For the Americans, their fleet was built to dominate important internal waterways, to cut the Confederacy down the Mississippi River, aid in the capture of important Confederate cities, and enforce a blockade of Confederate ports. The U.S. Navy achieved these goals. The Royal Navy was built to be a globally dominant naval force, able to protect its colonies and defend the home island from any European naval power. It too accomplished its goals. The next step in evaluating a navy is how it builds for its doctrine. Most building programs take many years to complete, and doctrines can change partway through a building program. The leftover ships from 20 or 30 years ago may not fit well with current doctrine. Which brings us back to the Russian Navy. What was Russian naval strategy, and how does it compare to more dominant navies? Russia faces several primary theaters of operation: the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and the Far East. The Russians, during the time of the Russo-Japanese War and throughout the World Wars, relied on a fortress doctrine, where their naval forces are subordinate to their land army and only act as support forces, with the Navy receiving support from land-based fortifications. This naval doctrine was very passive and defensive in nature. The fortress fleet doctrine should not be confused with the fleet in being doctrine, which is a much more offense-oriented doctrine, meant to hold down an enemy fleet until a momentary advantage can be leveraged to gain victory and ultimately control of the sea. The passivity of Russian naval doctrine was criticized by great naval theorists like Mahan, who viewed it as creating a culture of stagnation, tying the fleet too closely to land-based resources, and constricting maneuver to the point where control of the sea was all but impossible. Understanding the fortress fleet concept puts Russian naval decisions in a better context. So many times Russian vessels are used to guard a port at the expense of sorties or maneuver. Mahan was likely correct in claiming that the Russians stunted their offensive capabilities by adopting this extremely defensive doctrine. The Russians, with their forces spread thin, likely realized, especially after the experience of the Crimean War, that they could not stand up to another major European naval power on equal terms. Their inability to concentrate their forces spread across several theaters of operation meant that their navy would almost always be on the defensive. This allowed the Japanese to defeat the Russian Navy in detail in the Russo-Japanese War. Some have criticized the Russians for not taking more time to train the 2nd Pacific Squadron, but if the objective was supplying reinforcements to Port Arthur, it was very time-sensitive. If the 2nd Pacific Squadron had arrived before the fall of Port Arthur, perhaps things would have ended differently. The Japanese would have had to contend with 2 naval threats instead of being able to concentrate all of their available forces on one naval threat at a time. The failure of the Russian land armies in Manchuria was where the war was truly lost. The Russians had been defeated both on land and at sea by the time peace was concluded. If the Russians had won at Tsushima, they could have blocked Japanese supplies and reinforcements, allowing Russian ground forces to advance. If the Russians were able to dominate the land campaign from the start, Japanese naval superiority would have been largely moot, as Russia simply needed to maintain the status quo to win the war. The Japanese took a far more active approach to naval warfare, going on the offensive from the first day of the conflict. Japanese naval doctrine relied upon local superiority of forces. Japan was isolated by thousands of miles from the homelands of the Western powers. The Japanese alliance with the British served to isolate a nation like Russia in the event of a conflict. Other European powers would be far less likely to join in a war against Japan if said war could also involve fighting the Royal Navy. The Japanese had the luxury of operating close to home, with British-built battleships, training from Royal Navy officers, and access to advanced fire control technology. The alliance with Britain, which held the most extensive colonial holdings and influence out of any European power, rendered transit and resupply difficult for any Russian reinforcements. The Japanese used their advantage to train and maintain their fleet. The Japanese ships, having not traveled halfway across the globe, enjoyed a marked speed advantage over their Russian counterparts. The Japanese fleet was also far more balanced in its composition, having far more cruisers and light ships than the Russians. The Japanese had high explosive shells, the Russians had lethargic armor-piercing shells with antiquated bursting charges. The Japanese built a fleet for regional dominance in the Pacific over a single front. They used this fleet in exactly the way it was designed to be used. The victory at Tsushima was a great victory, but it would actually weaken Japanese strategic planning in the decades to come, especially after the First World War and the dissolution of their alliance with Britain. The Western powers routinely underestimated Japan, making the Russian defeat all the more shocking. The Western powers would continue to underestimate Japan well into World War II. For example, it wasn't until after the war ended that the Allies fully understood the effectiveness of Japanese torpedoes. If the Russian fleet had been crushed by the British instead of the Japanese, would the battle have been as humiliating? One has to wonder how much anti-Japanese prejudice played a role in Russia's international humiliation. The Russian building programs to meet their doctrine were where they were really let down. Russian shipbuilding was notoriously slow, and there were so many classes where there are many ships planned, but very few actually completed. This trend follows Russia into the modern era. If Russia had a more offensive, less risk-averse doctrine, they may have seen more success. The Japanese were very concerned about a Russian breakout from Port Arthur, but the Russians were not aggressive in attempting to achieve one. When the fleet at Port Arthur finally attempted to sortie, the resulting Battle of the Yellow Sea was still a Japanese victory, though far less immediately decisive than the Battle of Tsushima. The Japanese would force the Russians to stay in port, vulnerable to the Japanese guns possessed by their land forces. Some of the Russian ships would have their guns removed to help in the land battle, but defeat was just a matter of time. It can be reasonably said, a fortress fleet is lost without its fortress. A fortress fleet is generally tied within several miles of the fortress and struggles to project force beyond its immediate proximity. In the missile era, a fortress fleet may be far more viable, especially in the era of hypersonic long-range weapons. Still, this doctrine is really only a defensive one, capable of projecting force within close range of its home bases. The core difference between Japanese and Russian naval doctrine is that the Russian Navy was, in essence, an extension of its land base, whereas the Japanese Navy was its own independent unit that would seek a decisive battle. Most people tend to focus on the disaster of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, but largely the Russian forces did what they were intended to do. They were supposed to protect their fortress. They fell, more or less, when the fortress fell. If the Russian ground forces had been competent in the land war against Japan in Manchuria, the war would have likely had a different outcome. Hey, thank you for watching until the end of this video. This was slightly better produced than the last one. I might have actually put together a script for this one, which is why I sound like I'm reading. So, if any of you have a comment or suggestion, feel free to put them down below.